Hello, everyone. Tom Delba Carl. Welcome back to another show. Pretty excited actually this week about the show. It was a huge week for the Supreme Court, their end of session decisions, pretty big decisions at that. So I'll be reviewing that in segment number one. And then in segment number two, we're going to be talking with our guest. We're going to be talking about the changing strategic everything strategic about the Middle East, what it was before and what it is now. Just 10 years ago, who were the players in the Middle East versus today? It's a pretty interesting discussion, and I think you're going to enjoy that. And then we're going to wind up the show with another great discussion about the Democrats and their civil war. They just nominated a avowed socialist, anti-Semitic, everything you can worry about if you're a Democrat to be the mayor of New York. I'm sure you heard it. You'd have to be under a rock not to have heard that. We're going to talk about how the Democrats are worried about that and the implications for such a nomination. But first, let's start out with the Supreme Court and two really big cases, or actually, they came down with multiple cases, but the biggest one related to President Trump's application with respect to uh, limiting what circuit courts can do. As you're well aware, circuit courts, they're everywhere, right? There's over 700 of those circuit courts. And those circuit courts have been imposing injunctions. And by the way, I've been an attorney 38 years, 37 years too long. But what the individual circuit courts would do, whether you were in Washington, the state of Washington, or anywhere else, is they would put an injunction into place, let's say in Seattle, Washington. There would be a plaintiff from that district. They would complain about something the president did in an executive order and otherwise. And these courts, many consider them to be activist courts, what they would do is they would not only just make a ruling affecting that particular plaintiff, but then they would extend that ruling to every one of the states, all 50 states, what they call a universal injunction. And what we're going to talk about is what the Supreme Court did in that regard, which is to severely limit that capacity. And then, of course, we're going to talk about the other case related to Planned Parenthood, where the Supreme Court decided that the state of South Carolina can make the choice not to fund Planned Parenthood with Medicaid dollars. So we're going to talk about two of those things. So let's get right to it. So let's talk about the big decision regarding injunctions. And as you can see here, what you have is a headline talking about how the Supreme Court limits injunctions, nationwide injunctions. And that's sort of the big word here, nationwide injunctions. And what the Supreme Court did in that case, and we might as well talk about briefly the same with the South Carolina state. I have said, and we'll put it up here, my tweet with regard to this. This Supreme Court will be known in history, because what happens is once a Chief Justice steps down, they characterize that Supreme Court justice's tenure. But now that there are six, and with conservatives, sometimes not so conservative, but with Amy Coney Barrett there, and Gorsuch, and Thomas, and Alito, the Roberts Court will be known in the future as the court that for limiting government institutions to their statutory roles. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you hearken back to the Chevron decision of last year, what the court ruled and what that case was about was Chevron complained that the regulatory bodies were going beyond their authorized power and taking congressional laws and adding to them, not keeping within the limits of that law, but going beyond what Congress legislated. And it was a huge decision, not just for Chevron, but for everyone, because what the Supreme Court said, your power as a regulator in that branch of government only goes so far as what the Congress authorized you to do. You have to stay within those limits. And that is pretty statutory. What they're saying is you're a part of government. You can go no farther than your part. And your part under our constitutional system as a regulator is defined by Congress. That is the same thing that they did with respect to this Trump case, which everyone thinks it's about this issue of birthright citizenship. But really what they did at this stage is say that the lower courts, they too have to stay within their limits. And so let's talk about some of the language the court uh, uses to talk about why they made this decision. One of the things they say was, quote, because the universal injunction lacks historical pedigree, it falls outside the bounds of federal courts' equitable authority under the Judiciary Act. Judiciary Act's very old. What their point is that there's no history of these circuit courts, now 700, but they used to be a handful way back in the day. There's no history of them doing that. In fact, the court says, quote unquote, universal injunctions were conspicuously non-existent for most of the nation's history. Their absence from the 18th and 19th centuries, so the 1700s and the 1800s, in equity practice settles the question of judicial authority. What are they saying? They're saying if we want to know what the Constitution means, we can look at past practice. And in the past, these injunctions didn't occur for 200 plus years. And so what they did was say they're holding, the word they use is it is held. This is our definitive rule. In this case, the government is likely to succeed on the merits of its claim that district courts, here it is, lacked authority to issue universal injunctions. And so what they're saying is all these 700 courts can't make an injunction which affects the entire country. And and then within the case, if you read farther, you come to understand that they say, look, if the plaintiff in Washington or in Southern California or in the South, wherever the case starts, maybe it's Maine, if that plaintiff was wronged by something the administration did in its policy, then that plaintiff can sue. And maybe that plaintiff wins a case as it relates to that plaintiff. But that plaintiff can no longer say, and the court can no longer rule, that everyone else in the country gets the same benefit as that client. Now, why is this important? Well, for one thing, the courts, all these 700 circuit courts, were acting beyond their authority. So just like that regulatory body with regard to the Chevron case was doing more than it was what it was allowed to do by law, these circuit courts have to go back and fit within their boxes. Now, does this mean that all these unconstitutional things are going to occur and everything's going to go to hell in a social justice sense? No. Here's what happens. We actually have a system, by the way, of how this works. The system works where if there's a case in Washington and the plaintiff wins an injunction, then the president, in this case, of the United States, would appeal that case. Everybody else in the country still has to deal with it. Now, let's say there's another case in Texas, or in this case, let's say Maine, liberal court in Maine, and they do the same thing. But then there's a case in Texas that does the opposite thing. The appeal process moves it along, and then they all wind up in front of the Supreme Court. The difference here is the old-fashioned system of appeals will still work. The immediate nationwide injunction disappears. And that's important because, again, this court's going to be known for putting government institutions back within their constitutional authority. They can't go beyond it. In fact, the court had a great line that said this: when a court concludes that the executive branch has acted unlawfully, any one of these courts, the answer is not for the court to exceed its power to. In other words, it may be that in Washington, the court feels Trump did something inappropriate, but the circuit court cannot exceed its own powers. That's important because A, it gets rid of this form of lawfare. It gets rid of the universal injunction, which can stop a presidency. And we now go back to the normal process. So if you're a fan of a constitutional system, or you believe, like Thomas Jefferson, that the federal courts would assume all this power and warp things, then you're a fan of this ruling, and we're in a better place in the United States. That's our first segment. Next up, let's go to foreign policy and the big strategic change with the bombing of Iran. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. My first love in politics was foreign policy, and the world has changed, especially with respect to the Middle East. And that's why I'm particularly pleased with my next guest, Darin Gaub, who is a worldwide strategist. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but his experience is extraordinary, and he understands the Middle East intimately and the changes that it is undergoing. There's his book right there. Darin, why don't you say hello and then tell us a little, give us the elevator pitch on the book and what you achieved.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. First of all, what a pleasure to join you and your listeners here. And the overview of the book is really I wanted to be able to translate my military background, my faith background, leadership background into asking hard questions and providing hard answers that even sometimes I don't necessarily even fully agree with myself, but I thought it was valid to ask and answer the best I can into a compilation of about 100 different 3 to 5 page articles running a multitude of topics. So you could flip through it and read any one of them in any order that you wanted to, like on a coffee stand, and be able to say, you know what, I agree with some of this, or I disagree with some of this. None of it's exhaustive, but I think it's worth asking the questions and having people pursue their desire to learn more about topics where maybe I've piqued their interest on something, or maybe pitched it in a different way that they have maybe heard it in the past. So that's really the goal there. It's not a bio. There's only 4 pages of any bio information. This is a book of multiple ideas designed to engage people and hopefully spark interest and debate. And I think debate is healthy.
So tell us also about your experience in tours of duty.
The experience in tours what?
And tours of duty.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. I'm one of those guys who got out of high school, enlisted in the infantry in the army, and wanted to be Rambo, like everybody of the Gen X era seemed like. And then got out, was going to go into the business world, found out that really wasn't for me. Went into ROTC, got commissioned as an officer into Army Aviation, and flew the Black Hawk helicopter. That's the reason why that picture is the cover of the book, and that's actually me flying that aircraft on the cover. So that's what's neat about it. So as an aviation officer specialist, also became even more of a strategist. That sort of a hobby I had before became formalized. Because in the military, you can be what's called a generalist, which means you do different things that aren't necessarily related to your specific branch. So I went into advanced military studies, global geopolitics works, diplomacy, military, economics, all the above. Mixed in among all that was tours to South Korea, North Africa, all over Europe, 4 tours in Afghanistan, and multiple flights to different places around the world for different reasons, and spent a lot of time being an expert on these topics and talking to the generals and the Congress and everybody else and saying, hey, here's what I think you should say. This is probably what the reality on the ground is here.
Which is exactly why I'm going to love this discussion with you right now. But before we get to the heart of what I wanted to talk about, uh, for I, I'm completely blessed. I was born in '61. I did not live to the point where I was drafted into anything. I have lived at the I want to say so many that have done so many things for us. And in my book, The Lessons of the American Civilization Over My Shoulder, I talk about the way we used to view America prior to Vietnam and the way,
Mhm.
I'm sorry, America viewed the military prior to Vietnam and the way half the country now seems to think about it. So when you watch this past week, all the questioning about it, as someone who put his life on the line, what are your thoughts about that? Not so much the
Yeah.
issue of whether it worked or not, but the
Yeah.
attitude.
Well, yeah, I think one of the key lessons here is that the question of whether or not we should have executed this mission, that's something that the politicians should take up. The military can take it on privately amongst themselves and have those kinds of discussions, but our job is to take the orders, make sure that they're actually legal and constitutional, of course, and execute them to the best of our ability, and come back and say, okay, we did that, and assess whether or not we completed the task effectively, regardless of whether or not on the strategic side or the political side it achieved the overall aims of what they were seeking. Because Congress through the president sends people to war. That's how it works. They're the ones who have to answer those questions. It doesn't mean that we're just a bunch of robots who are just programmed to don't think for ourselves. We most certainly do, and we'll engage in very healthy debates on whether or not you know just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. That's what's interesting to me when in watching all of this. So I would say separate the two. Is did the military conduct the mission in an expert manner and come home safely the way they were supposed to? I would say 100% they absolutely did. Knowing how these missions operate, knowing what they're supposed to accomplish, uh, yes, that was done. Was the effect achieved from a strategic, a political, strategic, and military perspective dealing with the Middle Eastern security situation and all that? We don't have that answer yet, I don't think, but I think we have most of the answer, and that is that Iran's nuclear weaponization program, has been significantly hindered. That doesn't mean it's perfectly hindered. That assessment will take some time, but I would ask people to separate the question of whether we should do it. We let the politicians answer that, and then focus on, if you're going to talk about the military, whether or not it was done the way it was supposed to be done, and most certainly it was.
Thank you for that. So, my father used to be on the UN World Food Council, and he started me reading Foreign Policy magazine literally as a
Mhm.
10-year-old. And the world is a complicated place, much so more today than I think 30, 40 years ago. Before the Berlin Wall fell and the
Mhm.
Soviet Union broke up, you had what we call the bipolar world, and you had client states. The Middle East has become incredibly complicated because even after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Russia had interests. If we can put up that first map, and in the red, folks, you can see those are states that over a decade ago Russia had an interest in. The bluer states related to not aligned with Russia, Turkey's NATO, and other states. But now, and it was this world, was it not, where if you were going to deal with a particular country, you had to take into account Russia and maybe deal directly with Russia. Now the Middle East, though, has seen a different player. We have the collapse of Syria. We have what's gone on in Iran. You have Hamas, Hezbollah, who were the surrogates of Iran. So the chessboard has moved, or if you will, the game of Risk has changed dramatically. And I don't think I've heard enough on TV, which is why I wanted you on, to talk about how different is this world and the different players. If we bring up the next two pictures real quick to do it and then have at it. This is a map that shows China's interest now in the Middle East, in the countries in which they have some level of influence and or significant commerce. And then bring up the last one, uh, and maybe and you may have to bring that one back, but please get a good gander of that. So, Darin, have at it as long as you want. Tell us about where we were, and if you can, where you think we're going.
Oh boy, only half an hour, huh?
Yeah, there
No,
you go, longer.
this is the view of things I love to have at times because I teach a lot of different things, and one thing I like to talk about is the idea of fractals and being able to zoom into something to a micro level. But sometimes you have to really zoom out to kind of get themes and trends that these are not necessarily the things you talk about on the news. You talk about whether or not did a massive ordnance penetrator do enough damage to a nuclear facility to eradicate it. Now, that by and of itself is can be interesting, but when you back out, you start seeing trends. And what I'm personally seeing is that yes, you're gone from a post Cold War two-sided environment where everything was communism versus capitalism, and everything else was those client states, and everybody seemed to pick a side and run on the side, and maybe occasionally try to run the fence a little bit so they could be friends of both, depending on the situation. To really what uh, is what I would call the Balkanized kind of a world, and that's specific to the region, of course, of the Balkans and Southeast Europe, where they fractured into all these different tribes and smaller nations and things like that, and were at war, and in some ways still at it uh, for years, trying to really settle differences and grievances that occurred over sometimes generations. But that balkanization has really spread out some to, and let's just use the Middle East as an example, because I think Americans generally seem to lump everything from Iran over to Egypt, up to Turkey, and down to the tip of even Yemen, maybe even into Somalia, as some sort of conglomerate of everything being the same. But the reality of it is, they're really broken apart into competing interests and tribes, and they have something called oil. And so some of these major players come into this balkanized environment and try to figure out, who do you talk to? Who's your friend? Who's an ally? Who's maybe willing to go with the highest bidder, and who's truly an enemy? And as you look at all of this, I see a trend through the Middle East becoming more towards more stable actors who realize that it's in their self-interest to be economically productive for the sake of their people, or even for the sake of their own regime necessarily, and less towards constant conflict and tribal of a tribal nature more necessary than a national nature, because tribes drive more than boundaries often in the Middle East, because the boundaries were just random lines drawn post British Empire that may not have reflected the reality. That's what I'm seeing, a move towards essentially what could become uh, more people joining something like the Abraham Accords as a bit of a detente, a peace, a semi-stable peace, even acknowledging the fact that Israel exists and has the right to exist. And if that occurs among nations like Saudi Arabia and others, it will grow out. And then the big question mark is, can the people of Iran, I mean Persia, see some sort of growth pattern towards the same kind of a chance at freedom and liberty like they used to enjoy prior to the fall of the Shah in 1979, when they looked a lot more like a European nation as far as the level of freedom they enjoyed than clearly they do now. If that happens, that's a huge deal, and I think everybody in the West should applaud that move, encourage that kind of move for the sake of the people of Iran, because it's their government that we don't like. It's just like we don't like the Chinese Communist Party in China. We don't like the dictators in Iran. It's generally the governments that are the problem, and not the people. I think the people would grab onto that kind of freedom, and if that occurred in Iran, that would be huge for the Middle East, because the biggest destabilizing actor is Khamenei and his like within Iran. If you take that off the table, as we've already largely removed their proxy actors and Hamas, Hezbollah, uh, Houthi rebels, and others, you're going to surround the bad part of Syria, and with a whole lot of better actors, and hopefully you end up with something that would just be extremely positive for the greater Middle East, and it would grow out from there. Last thing I'll say is one thing that's of interest, though, on the colors of that map. It shows Turkey as a NATO ally, which it is. But they're the ones that run the fence with Russia, because Russia knows they need the Bosporus access out of the Black Sea in order to maintain the full access and capability of their warm water ports. So it's not always one color defines them.
Yes, I would agree with that. So I wrote a piece last week on Substack talking about one of the reasons why this occurred when it did was that Russia is bogged down in Ukraine and doesn't have the same level of abilities or influence that it had a decade ago. And in many ways, at least in my view, you know more, walked away from Syria, didn't think that it was worth or they had the ability to prop it up. China's having it, as you know, China's having its own difficulties. They need Iran because they need the oil, right?
Right.
So, how much does the troubles of China and Russia play a part in what's unfolding right now in the Middle East and going forward?
Well, trending on that would be the need for people, have some of the leadership of Iran went immediately to China after this happened. And that's because you could say that the sale of oil to China is keeping China's economy alive, as well as providing the necessary funding to Iran to even keep going. Because you're looking at two nations with dictatorial regimes, both of them teetering on a bit of a precipice for different reasons. Khamenei is, of course, the greatest threat to his stability. Is his own people there waking up, and I use the term "his own people," meaning the people of Iran. There's definitely a difference between those two. Um, and China's economic problems, housing problems, driven through currency and real estate, multiple different issues there. Their economy is weak and getting weaker. Iran's is tied to that the same. And if we take, as we've taken away their nuclear generating capability, if we were to remove their ability to export oil out of Iran to places like China, uh, they wouldn't have much of an economy left at all, and China would be hurt severely as well. So those two are tied at the hip. How does Russia fit in? Of course, well, Iran is also making money selling drones to Russia for the Russia-Ukraine conflict. and as well as China is selling things to Russia to making money off of them. Also, ultimately, somewhere in all of this is the concerns over access to energy. Russia's getting hurt pretty bad because the Western European markets to buy their energy are not open, and you can only stay on a war footing for so long of an economy before it collapses of its own weight. So the question for Iran, China, Russia, as that axis of evil, for lack of a better word, is: are they all going to drag each other down? That's a distinct possibility, and that's also a distinct concern because if they do that, uh, you would remember the show Hunt for Red October. You know this question of the crazy Ivan.
Yeah.
When a nation's going through these hard times, what are they going to do? Would they just allow themselves to collapse if they have the time to just allow that, or would they do something like, I don't know, create an invasive scenario against Taiwan per se, or Iran could decide to take the IRGC and just say, hey, you know what, we're just going to send them all west, uh, across Iraq, maybe into Israel. I find that very unlikely, of course, because Iran's military is designed to keep the people of Iran down, not necessarily, engage in foreign conquest. I guess that's where I would go with that: energy, access, trade, and economies.
Okay, so let's drill down a little bit. Iran, Saudi Arabia. Do you subscribe to those who say that the reason for October 7, uh, at least part of that, was to stop the Saudis from getting closer to the Abraham Accords? And where does that process lie now? Because if the Saudis joined, wouldn't that create a much uh, bolder future for the Middle East? So, do you subscribe to that theory, and where does that lie going forward, if you can?
Yeah, I subscribe to the theory, whether it was by design or just by accidental result. I don't always, unless I'm part of the plan and I can see why they're doing what they're doing specifically. I'm very careful not to say this is an absolute what happened and why, but it seems like a very clear and obvious outcome was the ending of the very near rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And of course, Biden was certainly willing to let that divide stay in place for his own reasons. Uh, However, after October 7th, I was very clear on a number of outlets saying that that particular attack would also be the end of Iran's dictators, one way or another, and whether they be ineffective or whether or not they just disappear. I had some people look at me like they thought I was crazy.
Okay, well, expand on that if you would.
Well, so the attack of Hamas on Israel provided the impetus for the Israeli people to be able to accept a much greater amount of risk in doing what they would have to be doing in order to remove these three proxy armies, specifically two, from the chessboard. That's Hamas and Hezbollah primarily. Now, Houthis, slightly different, but in the end, the same thing as far as getting funded by Iran as hammers against the people of Israel. When you provided the people of Israel enough motivation to disregard much of what the world opinion would turn into, what the United Nations would do, and say, we're going to go into Gaza regardless, and we're going to eradicate this threat. By the way, while we're at it, there's another one to our north called Hezbollah, and we're just going to do what is necessary to make them ineffective. We're going to use those systems and techniques that they've been developing for many, many years to effectively remove those pieces from the board. Once you had that motivation and desire to do that, you remove the only thing Iran really had left to directly impact Israel in a way that Iran wanted to. Punishing attacks by missiles is not going to ever really truly achieve anything of a strategic end that is useful. Iran can punish all day long by throwing missiles at people, but what it can't go over there and do is own the ground, invade them and own the ground. They're just not going to do that. They're not capable of doing it. And as soon as they moved enough armies to do that, uh, well, the people of Iran would notice, and I would guarantee that dictatorial regime would cease to exist. So that's what I'm saying, that the trickle up economics of this is you're taking the toys away from Tehran. And by doing that, you're minimizing their effect. You're showing them weakness on a global scale. And in the end, at some point, they're just going to be largely irrelevant as a regime. And hopefully, and this is the part that's really, really in question, can the people and will the people of Iran be able to step up and remove them for themselves and bring in the government in exile that exists and is ready to go? It's not a perfect answer, but it's a lot better than what they have now.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Mhm.
I have been saying that Iran, Persia is quite different than Iraq.
Yeah.
Remember when Saddam Hussein fell, although there was some level of historical sophistication there, it's nothing like Persia. People need to, if they want to go back into their history books, uh, Persia is one of the great civilizations in all of history. Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes, their battles with ancient Greece, and not just a warring power, but pretty high culture, and
Mhm.
not just for a couple of weeks or a couple of decades. You're talking about 2,500 years ago. And so they were very sophisticated before the 1979 quote revolution, however you want to describe it, right?
Mhm.
So so their chance of, in my view, of emerging from this, if somehow the powers that be were swept away, are different and better than it was in Iraq. But what did you make of Trump saying they don't want regime change, or he's not advocating for that? Why isn't he? He may say, "I'm not going to do it, but I want it." What'd you make of that? What should be done?
Yeah, I heard that, and I was like, "Well, are we saying that we, America, are not going to engage in regime change and not repeat the mistakes of something like in Iraq or even in Afghanistan?" I can get behind that because ultimately, the people of a nation have to own their own future in order for it to take hold, take root, and stay there. It, let's equate that to nation building. And clearly, we've failed on that on a number of fronts, and we keep repeating the same mistake. I'm hoping that he's not saying that we're not interested in helping Iran uh, achieve that kind of a result to where Khamenei and all those people are made irrelevant and replaced by an actual effective government that can allow the people of Iran to thrive as they so well deserve to have the chance to do. Uh, in that case, I would have to disagree with Trump. I would personally stand up behind a podium and call on the Iranian people and say, "Hey, listen, if you're going to stand up against your dictators and help remove them, we will do what we can to help you." And frankly, we've already done some of that just because of the recent missions over there. Israel has done it too. We got to give him credit, and we
Is
know it's for self-preservation. But if the after effect is the great Persian people coming back into the fold and what they can be, I'd be thrilled. And yes, I agree with you. This is Persia. This is one of the world's greatest empires with a very sophisticated, high level culture that can return and that should return. I would be thrilled. And frankly, if they do that, let them rename it Persia. I think that would be great. Just get rid of the name Iran.
so, I mean, what Radio Free Europe, the genesis of that was speaking to those oppressed behind the Iron Curtain, was it not? Radio
Yeah.
Free Cuba, same type of thing. Was it Eisenhower or Truman who was off in a ship off the speaking to Yugoslavia when Tito, but behind there? Why don't we have that similar desire to at least speak of the virtues of freedom and say we will support you? What? Why is that out of fashion? I remember Obama being criticized, or at least I criticized him for not supporting it in the past?
Yeah, it's some of this I would say goes back a little bit to the book about the lessons of the American civilization and where we are now. And we don't see ourselves as this beacon of freedom as much
Yeah.
as we should. And the question is, are we the example of freedom that we should be? Well, compared to many nations of the world, I would say we still are. And we need to continue to pursue that and improve it as always. Uh, I don't see any problem with something like a Voice of America broadcasting the ideals of liberty and freedom throughout the Middle East, just like we used to do. Just because we don't necessarily live up to them ourselves sometimes doesn't mean that the pursuit of them is not worth it. It absolutely is. And most people still come to America. They don't try to leave it. It's an odd thing. So we must still be doing something right.
Okay, before we're getting close to running out of time. Where are you on the fate of President Xi and China? Do you see this as him being pushed aside, and then what direction do they take?
Well, at some point, with his age and everything, he is going to have to be replaced. But right now, the intelligence and information I'm getting out of China is that they're uh, sort of growing into different factions, a couple, maybe three at the most. And some of that is the military side of things, actually somewhat aligning against Xi and the government, civilian government side of things, even though that line is pretty dang thin. And I think the reason why that is because things are so bad in China, economically specifically, that she's staying power is truly kind of limited at this point. And just with the right kind of push, the right direction, his time in power could be extremely limited. Even though he barely has been reelected for what a year plus now into that position. So I'm watching it closely because it goes right back to the most dangerous times in nations' histories for themselves and others, especially when you're dealing with nuclear powers. Is the point of transition between two authorities, I guess, and is the next one worse than the last?
Yeah. So, um, if I was thinking about Pakistan when you were talking about
Mhm.
that, the military overthrows of leaders now and then for quote stability reasons. Okay, you had these initiatives; they haven't worked out, and we don't really care if you do some things, but if you're going to cause us to collapse, we have to come back in and take control.
Right.
Is that a good analogy, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a fair analogy because it's in the end, it always comes down to what kind of life are the people leading, and specifically those who either see themselves either going down with Xi if he goes down, or see themselves replacing him. And some are kind of slowly jumping onto that side of business to say, hey, you know what? If he goes down, I'm going to be standing over here with my new friends. And we think we have somebody who would replace Xi in this case. And it's the typical Game of Thrones type of scenario. There's a lot of gambles. There's a lot of risks. Some are gonna win, and some are gonna be dead. And if this all goes down that way, and it very well could. This whole distraction about China invading Taiwan hasn't helped. As their economy collapses, they're building up their military under this impression that that Belt and Road Initiative map that you showed is still viable. You'll hear news about it, but it's really not working. And that's what you're seeing actually now, in my opinion, is that you're seeing a shrinking of the Eastern sphere and their influence through China, other than through like a lot of international government agencies, the United Nations and stuff, and a slow growth again of the Western sphere. Because even though our economy is not necessarily always the strongest and we have a lot of debt compared to China and nations like that, we're looking pretty dang good.
Okay, in the minute we have left, I gotta ask you, they just had the NATO summit.
Mm-hmm.
They have pledged their goal to get to 5%. Did you think that would be the outcome? I mean, 15 years ago, we were paying for everything virtually, right?
Yeah,
Are the European countries waking up in that? I mean, think about how great their standard of living has been because they didn't have to pay for their defense, right? They could put money towards social justice and all these other things they wanted to. And we have created debt in our own right for that. Are they really coming around to this? Will this last beyond Donald Trump? Is really my question.
uh, I think if it lasts beyond Donald Trump, it'll be because something has lasted beyond Putin and the perception that Putin has some desire to roll over all of Europe. It's a completely different argument that I don't necessarily agree with, but that is there nonetheless. Either way, I wholeheartedly support Europe paying for its own defense, getting off of their dependency on us. And I was actually a little surprised at the 5% number. I've spent a lot of time over there. And what I will tell you is it's not only how we fund the defense of Europe in general, but all of our soldiers and the different civilian contractors and everything that's over there. That's all money that goes into the European economy through paychecks. And so that money is helping Europe in many ways. In fact, I had a task force in Latvia that had a fair amount of money tied to the mission. Guess what? All that money, they loved us being there, not because they thought we could stop Russia with some Black Hawks and a couple Chinooks and a medevac bird, but because we were going on to the economy and spending a lot of money.
Wow. Yeah, I guess I haven't really thought about it that way, but of course that is it, right? And that's probably true in some other places around the world as well.
Oh, sure.
Well, Darren, we've run out of time. I'm hoping you'll commit to coming back maybe in a couple, 3 or 4 months, and continuing to talk about this changing chessboard or the game of risks that's out there.
Right.
Because I'm trying to think of who it was initially said that life was much easier in a bipolar world. But then again, guys like you wouldn't rise to the top because you have the ability to see it all. So we really appreciate you coming to Politics and Perspective this week. Thanks so much.
Oh, happy to do it. Thanks for having me again.
All right, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Politics and Perspective. I hope you enjoyed that segment with Darin Gaub. The world is changing rapidly, and as far as the Middle East, I, for one, think it's in a better place, and there's a chance for a greater peace, as my guest and I discussed. But now let's go to a place where a lot of nervousness and not a lot of peace within the Democrat Party. This past week, we saw the primary for New York City mayor. Now, keep in mind, the New York City mayor is by far the biggest mayorship. Although LA County is bigger than 42 states, the city of LA, that mayor has half the constituents, less than half, than New York City. So Karen Bass and all her mistakes, which you see, is still pretty small. New York's different. It's a huge deal. Not only do you have well over 8 million people, you also have the financial center, some people say, of the world. And what did the Democrats do? Well, in a low turnout election with all these special things we're going to talk about real quick, they elected a joke. A guy who's 33 years old. He's a failed rapper. He is Muslim. He is an anti-Semite. He's an avowed socialist with no experience. Never had an executive job in his life. And he's going to take on, if he wins, and he could, he's going to take on being the mayor of the biggest city in the United States. Why don't we pull it up as we can talk about this? First of all, it was a unique election because Eric Adams is the sitting mayor of New York. He's running again as an independent. If you recall, he was pushed out of the Democrat Party because he was indicted by Biden because he pushed back against Biden uh, on immigration. Trump pardoned him. Adams leaves the party. Now he's running as an independent. So the Democrat Party included Andrew Cuomo, the son of the former governor of the state, Mario Cuomo. If you remember, Andrew Cuomo had to resign under a shroud of guilt, and he did a horrible job on COVID. So he came with a ton of baggage, and he took this for granted. And Mondani, this 33-year-old out of nowhere, ran this, if you like, pretty darn good campaign. And so he stuns Cuomo, sending him away. Oh, wait, no, Cuomo still says he's still in the race. Point is, it was stunning because there was a unique circumstance here. Now, where does this leave? Who is this guy? Well, there he is. He's from the New York City Democrat Socialists. Now, what's a Democrat Socialist? That's a socialist with the name Democrat in front of it. You know who else is a socialist? Democrat socialist? I somehow got on this woman's email list. I get her stuff 2 times a day, but there she is, the one and only AOC. By the way, I said this before on the show. How many of you had AOC as the most, I don't know, quoted Democrat in 2025? I didn't have that. There she is. She's a Democrat socialist. She endorsed this guy. Bernie Sanders endorsed this guy. He's their candidate. Those two are considered to be the two most liberal people, socialist people, in Congress. And that's their boy. He wins. Now, this guy, he's got crazy policies. As you know, I have a newborn. My favorite policy of this guy is he's going to give away free baby baskets for all newborns. I know I missed out on that. I don't live in New York City, but obviously that's a big deal. But he's a socialist. He believes he's going to raise taxes up to $100 billion in new spending and free stuff. If we go on to the next, it is here. There is this headline from the Washington Post talking about his victory and sort of the consternation related to it. But let's listen to the man in his own words on one of his key programs, which is, quote, city-owned grocery stores.
Grocery prices are out of control. The cost of eggs and milk has skyrocketed. Some stores are even using dynamic pricing, jacking up the cost over the course of a day depending on what they can get away with. It doesn't need to be this way. I'm Zahran Mamdani, and as mayor, I will create a network of city-owned grocery stores. It's like a public option for produce. We will redirect city funds from corporate supermarkets to city-owned grocery stores, whose mission is lower prices, not price gouging. These stores will operate without a profit motive or having to pay property taxes or rent, and will pass on those savings to you.
Positively Soviet, by the way, literally. That's what Eastern Bloc countries used to say. They're better because their industries don't seek profit. They only care for the people. Venezuela as well. How'd that work for them? Right? By the way, you know what other state in the union, or what state in the union has signed up for government creation of insulin, or they wanted to do government banks? Yeah, that'd be Gavin Newsom's California. So now you know how far left he is. But this guy wants to have government-owned stores. Just think about that. And he wants a massive tax increase. I have a piece out on Fox about this, but here's the reality of it. What could go wrong with having a socialist the head of the financial center of the world, other than overcrowding in Florida? But will he win? I don't know. The Democrats are fretting over this almost as much as the Republicans are enjoying this. In fact, that's the word. There you have it. AP's headline, and this is repeated in papers throughout the country, including USA Today. Democrats fret about national fallout after Mondani stuns in New York City. And that's what I want to talk about the rest of the way here on the show. That's their worry. This guy is out there. Being a socialist is one thing, but he's also a Muslim who is an anti-Semite. Not all Muslims are rabid. Not all Muslims are anti-Semites, to be sure. But he is. He has talked about arresting, if he came to New York City, that would be Benjamin Netanyahu. What's in New York City? Oh, that's right, the UN. So this guy thinks he'll be able to do that sort of thing. And he has talked in terms related to Jews, which is the heart of the Democrat problem today, going to places like Columbia, Harvard, and all these other things. And the Democrats don't know what the hell to do. They already had people like the old guard, James Carville, the old guard, Bill Maher, although he said he was never a Democrat, he was certainly a liberal, and Doug Schoen, who used to work for Bill Clinton. They all say that AOC and Bernie should start their own their own party. But hello, they're within the Democrat Party and they're not going anywhere. And hence you get this intense disagreement about the future of the party. Meanwhile, Bill Clinton, Chuck Schumer, who needs to be radical to hold on to his position, guy has no scruples whatsoever. Kristen Gillibrand, New York. All of these Democrats, Bill Clinton was the last moderate center-left Democrat to be in the White House. Even he congratulated this guy who has no experience, outright anti-Semite, socialist. If he had his way, he'd be communist. So why is it that those old guard versus other old guard versus the energy in the party, Bernie Sanders? Unquestionably, the Democrats at this stage are in a civil war. And this is what I talk about in my Fox piece, which you can get at tomdell.com and at politicalvanguard.com, unquestionably, if this guy is the mayor of New York, and then you pair him up with Brandon Johnson in Illinois, and the other communist sympathizer, Karen Bass in LA, they will define the Democrat Party in the midterms and into 2028. And the Democrats will have nowhere to run. You can overlook Chicago by not following it. You can't overlook LA because it's so out of control. But New York is the financial capital of the world. Ain't nowhere to hide. And the Democrats are going to have to live with this. And it's going to cause division in this party for years to come. That's our show this week. I want to thank Patriot.tv. I want to thank AUN TV. You can find us on YouTube and Rumble. All the shows are at politicalvanguard.com. I appreciate you. Please share this, and we'll see you next time.